going to present a few results from an ongoing collaborative study with, as Katia said, Matias Lopes, Elisa Reis, and Hannah Tiga. It's actually a study that has been going on somehow for very long. Elisa Reis started the first studies in the 90s still on elites perceptions, and we've been carrying out this agenda with the new turns and more recently with a comparison with South Africa. So why Brazil and South Africa, and why we decided to take this turn? The first thing is that a lot of people would call those the most unequal or the most unequal democracies in the southern hemisphere. For a long time they have sort of run the race to see what was the most unequal country in the world. But also those are countries that have experienced important transitions to democracy with left-leaning political parties in power. And when I was hearing this morning the best case examples of redistribution, I would say that in the 2000s a study like this was conducted, probably Brazil and South Africa would appear as important examples of countries that are really trying to change structures and redistribute. More recently, however, those countries have been in the news for sadder reasons, so a lot on corruption scandals, crisis of legitimacy, and things like that. So on one hand, our puzzle that we wanted to look here is why those countries that have so much committed to democratization but also redistribution during a few years were now facing this important crisis, and what that had to do with elites' perception. So how elites that had supported redistribution for a while seem to have changed their perception. So that was a bit the puzzle. So we ask questions, more general questions, about how do elites in these two unequal societies understand the causes and the potential remedies for inequality. So now you can see a little bit my selfish question in the previous panel. It was very much related to what I'm interested at. Do they see inequality as a threat, but also as an opportunity? And why and how they agree to redistribution. I think this is a very important, more than if they agree to redistribution, we are really trying to understand under what conditions would they be willing, if any, to redistribution. So I'm going to go through this. I discussed this much more, we discussed this much more in detail in the paper, but what are we calling elites? And again here, my selfish comment in the previous panel. And here we are really trying to stick with the institutional definition of elites. So one thing, different from many other works, recent works on elites, we are not thinking simply about the super rich. We are really thinking about people who have key positions in parliament, civil society, civil service, and business. So in this paper that that I'm presenting and that you'll be able to read, if you are interested, we conducted a survey with the parliament's members, so elected officials at the federal level in Brazil and in South Africa. Civil service, top civil servants, usually in the ministries with the largest budgets in the two countries, and business, mostly CFOs, CEOs, and chairperson of the board. Usually I say chairperson, but it's mostly chairman of boards of the top 300 companies in the two countries. I'm happy to talk more about the methods in the Q&A, but we had a total of 180 questionnaires. Actually, in South Africa, we actually had 183 because we ended up having 3 politicians that ended up being included extra. So I don't think I have to talk too much about this, why do we care about, after reading the papers in these panels, why do we should care about perceptions of inequality. But I think it's important to keep in mind that beyond actions and beyond sort of the effects of elite action, a lot of studies have been thinking that what elites think about it, it's important because it affects those actions and it can actually create also some backlashes. So for a long time there's been a research agenda from Sidney Verba and his co-authors that dates back to the 80s, which has been looking at this and also looking at how there are important variances in how elites think about inequality, both nationally and through sectors of elites. More recently, Larry Bartels has been looking at partisan effects of inequality, looking at how much, although we keep saying that Republicans and Democrats are the same thing, when you actually look at their perceptions, there are important different perceptions, and those different perceptions actually have an impact on the type of agenda they are going to pursue. And finally, there is another work that is more macro-historical from Abraham Deswan which is looking at how the fact that inequality is seen as a threat by elites create an important opportunity that they want to redistribute, not because they see inequality as a problem for others, but because they start to see inequality as a problem for themselves. And that really creates an opportunity somehow to create redistribution. So I start with this very broad data that sort of confirms and answers a little bit the question that I posed in the two cases that I'm interested in. Do elites see social inequality as a problem? And overall, yes, they do. Nearly 100% of the elites see social inequality as a problem. But not to fully believe and to see how you ask questions actually influences the types of responses you're going to ask. When we ask them to ask between two choices, is social inequality always a problem? Or in moderate levels they can be beneficial to economy, then you can actually see that, well, inequality is a problem, but really depends on the level. So really understanding how much they see, and if they see inequality as too high, or if it's an inequality that can be dealt with, makes a big difference. And this is especially the case in South Africa, where more than half of the elites agree with that can be beneficial to economy. And this data, although it's not disaggregated here, and I kind of avoided, it's all in the paper disaggregated by sector, but here I'm using a few of the graphs, but as you're going to see, they are not very clear. But here it's important to think that business elites are the ones that are driving this understanding of inequality as beneficial. So nearly all business elites in South Africa tend to believe that it can be beneficial to economy, and in Brazil also nearly, I think, 80% of the business elites believe that inequality can be beneficial to economy. So, on the other hand, they do see that those negative effects of inequality for themselves. So, it's clear that in the two countries, violence and crime are the main way in which inequality negatively affects the lives of those elites. But other than that, you can see that there are important differences among the countries and even among the sectors. So, in Brazil, political patronage comes second. Followed by, I don't see it, lack of qualified workforce, which in South Africa it's more important than political patronage. So this actually, it's a lot of the results that are presented in the paper show that the South African elite seems to be much more worried about the consequences for economics and for sort of the structuration than the Brazilian one, which seems to be much more worried about the political consequences of these inequalities in terms of clientelism and patronage. But as already said in the last panel by Julian and Francisco, when they are asked about what is the most important goal of the country, inequality doesn't rank as high, especially for business elites. There you can really see that economic growth continues to be the most important. In South Africa, it's across all elite sectors. In Brazil, much more in the business sector, and while bureaucrats and politicians seem to be divided. Of course, it's important to think that those two things are not exclusive. A lot of those people, when we have a part of the study that is qualitative, a lot of them think that economic growth might be important because it's the only way that can create redistribution, a kind of trickle-down effect type of understanding. But still, it's interesting how do they see it, because that really creates a political agenda that is very different, but depending on what you see comes first. And in some interviews, it's clear that some people think the other way around. They think that redistribution is the only way to have a sustainable economic growth, which is a new narrative. When it comes to redistribution policies, they tend to see that redistribution policies are necessary in Brazil. They are not so convinced in South Africa, and quite a number, again, especially among business elites, tend to think that they should be avoided. And I think this result sort of echoes a little bit of what Jeremy Sickings will be talking, though thinking more broadly about sub-Saharan African countries. It's interesting to think about what they are thinking in terms of redistributive policies. And here we can see that they tend to think actually that certain redistributive policies are more desirable than others. So you can see here that food programs are particularly perceived as particularly desirable in South Africa. Subsidizing popular housing, it's surprisingly popular for those elites in the two countries. When it comes to guaranteed minimum income, not really. It's almost like it's too much. We are not willing to go that far. But it's interesting to also oppose what they find desirable and what they think is viable. And here you can see that the distance in South Africa is much stronger than it is in Brazil. In Brazil, it's almost like the elites tend to still believe that it's possible and it's doable. So they really believe on state capacity somehow to implement those policies. When it comes to social grant, which is sort of the most, especially in the case of Brazil, we were asking about conditional cash transfers, the Bolsa Família program more explicitly, it's clear that they tend to think that it has good and bad effects, especially in Brazil more so than in South Africa. Well, in South Africa, it tends to, the negative effects seems to be much more salient than the positive effects. But even in Brazil, when it comes to political patronage, it's clear that they are very much worried. And again, I'm not showing here, but in the paper I divided this by a sector, and it's clear that the business elites are again the ones that are most skeptical about those types of policies. When it comes to the most important initiative in reducing inequality, and I'm sorry that here not even I can read it, but in Brazil, a lot of people are asking for more efficient public policy services, while in the red line there that's very popular among business elites in South Africa and in Brazil, it's the greater deregulation of the economy. So it seems that this new liberal type of narrative is still quite strong among business elites, but not so much among the other two types of elites. So just to summarize, and I'm happy to talk more, and I discuss those results in much more detail in the paper, I think it's really important to think about perceptions of elites, to go beyond the idea of whether they want to redistribute or whether they think that inequality is a problem, to why and how they are willing to redistribute. It's really important to think, and I think I echo some of the things that have been said this morning, that there are important national differences and opportunities in this type of redistribution. And I think it's really important to think about elites and elite sectors and avoid thinking about elites as this homogeneous type of actor. Because the way that, although in the US it's very clear, and it's a lot of research on the influence of economic elites on political elites, I think that in other countries that type of relationship might be very different, which might create very different opportunities for redistributive policies. Thank you.